Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And the purpose of my talk is to share with you what a group of us, so this is not just me, what a group of us have been trying to do over the last couple of months. This group involves Dave, but also Ram, who is not here. I know he's on sabbatical, and Marit, and a bunch of other people from UWA, and then colleagues from Melbourne, but also internationally, New Zealand, Auckland, South Africa, Ghana, UK, and US. So this is our effort to engage with what we call here is Marit, good morning, non-market valuation of loss, values, places, and experiences with climate change. So some of you know me, but not everybody does. So let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm trained as a geographer. I'm what I call a human environment geographer. Some of my background is also in applied anthropology. And I've worked for the last 10 years or so on climate change adaptation, predominantly with farmers, small-scale farmers, in Ghana, Senegal, but also in Assam, Northeast India, and Nepal. And you can see two of those pictures here. I've also been involved in the IPCC as a coordinating lead author on a chapter of Working Group 2 in the last assessment report, which is the first time the IPCC had such a chapter, and it was the chapter on livelihoods and poverty. So some of what I'm going to share comes out of my experience working with farmers in, well, marginal environments, if you want. And the other element comes out of science insights into adaptation, limits to adaptation, and policy negotiations about what to do when we reach or cross these limits. So in order to provide us with a good entry point, I have several slides that are just background to lay out what the debate is and how we're engaging with that debate. So the first background is limits to adaptation, indeed. So several of you probably work on climate change, have an understanding what adaptation is and what limits to adaptation are. There's several ways of defining that. And I'm going to propose two definitions for these two words, adaptation and limits to adaptation, that you may not be familiar with. But these are ways of indeed defining them, and they're useful for our group. So we can see adaptation as an attempt to keep risks to valued objectives or objects at a tolerable level in the face of climate-related risks. Right? So what we value, we want to make sure that we keep the risks to what we value at a tolerable level. Limits to adaptation, by consequence, then are points at which our efforts to adapt fail to protect the things we value. Right? That has to do with what we value. And you will see I will come back to that. This is one way people who were involved in the IPCC, who think a lot about limits to adaptation, have tried to visualize that. So what you see on the x-axis is an adverse impact, the intensity of it, from negligible to catastrophic, and on the y-axis, the frequency of adverse impacts from very rare to very frequent. So down here, well, the risks are likely to be acceptable for many people. In the middle, that large space is what may still be a tolerable risk. But up on the right-hand corner here, we have intolerable risks that people may experience or perceive as intolerable in the face of very catastrophic and very frequent extreme events. Think of a drought, think of a flood. So we've been interested in understanding what happens here in these decision-making spaces. So that's background number one. Background number two is that the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, now has a mechanism which is called the Warsaw International Mechanism, because it was decided in Warsaw in 2013, to deal with what is called loss and damage. So the understanding here is that in the context of climate change, we know and we admit that adaptation and mitigation will not be able to prevent damages from occurring and losses from occurring. So there's a mechanism to deal with what to do with these residual effects when climate change, adaptation, and mitigation are not good enough. And this is called Approaches to Address Loss and Damage Associated with Climate Change Impacts in Developing Countries. Note that. So the focus is on developing countries, UN language. particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. So down here you see the group that sits in the executive committee of this mechanism. Annex 1, Annex 2 countries, Global North, Global South, nicely balanced. And here are 3 functions of this particular mechanism. We don't want to go into details. I've highlighted the first one, which simply says we need more knowledge to understand how these risk management approaches functions, how they address loss, in what circumstances, and particularly in the context of slow onset events, droughts, sea level rise. So we need more knowledge. Our group then, this is what we do, contributes to potentially addressing this knowledge gap. Background number 3. As an IPCC author, I was involved right after the 5th assessment report came out, which was in October 2014. I was involved in what is called a structured expert dialogue. Up here, structured expert dialogue. Number 4 was the 4th of those, that brought together IPCC authors and negotiators from the various parties to the UNFCCC. So all the country negotiators. And you can see us, we're sitting around the table. This happened at the COP, the Conference of the Parties in Lima. And I'm down here. You may see the red little hair here. That is me, indeed, at this huge table. And the purpose here was to understand, have a dialogue. So this was not a policy negotiation. It was a dialogue where the country negotiators could ask any questions they wanted on what was in the 5th assessment report. And the format was really interesting because most of these country negotiators had read the report, the summary for policymakers, the underlying chapters in detail. They knew exactly what was in there. But they would say, in chapter so-and-so, on page so-and-so, you have said so-and-so. Can you confirm that? And you know, if I had written that chapter, I would say, yes, I can confirm that A, B, C, and D. Strange, right? Why would they do that? Well, the purpose was to make sure that everything that was really important to them got on record with the UNFCCC. So it needed to be, the question needed to be asked, the response needed to be given, and that's what we did. The overall purpose was to test or to examine, re-evaluate, if you want, the adequacy of the long-term goal. What is the long-term goal? You guys know? What is the long-term goal in the UNFCCC? The long-term goal is to stay below, well, no, it actually doesn't say really. It says to stay below a potentially dangerous level, or a level that could be dangerous to interfere with da-da-da-da. It doesn't say 2 degrees. However, in 2009 at the COP in Copenhagen, the world apparently agreed that it should be 2 degrees. So in 2009, the 2-degree target was identified as a safe limit to reach that long-term goal, which is to stay below something that could potentially be dangerous. However, already in 2009, 70% of all the countries to the convention, predominantly the small island states and the LDCs, the least developed countries, said 2 degrees is by no means safe. Hence, the UNFCCC agreed that this should be revisited through a process which is called the review process, and the structured expert dialogue, and I was part of that, was the last in this review process to see whether or not 2.5 was really safe enough. And what came out of these discussions was that it's not safe. It's actually utterly unacceptable. And that was very important for the negotiators because they could carry that then into the negotiations. I wrote a paper on this very interesting science policy nexus or dialogue right thereafter, and it came out in, with quite a lot of press, actually. And it's called 1.5 or 2, Economist View from the Science Policy Interface at the COP20 in Lima. And in there, I argue, and this is just the abstract, but what is really important is that very last sentence of the article. I'm going to read this with you because that's what was in the media. So it's not about just finding the perfect target and doing calculations about what could be safe and what could not be safe. Remember, 2 or 1.5 is a global average. A global average really means over land, over the ocean, none nobody here in the room experiences a global average, right? So it's a construct that you and I can do because we master Excel, but in real life, people don't experience an average. So it's not about finding that perfect average. It is about acknowledging that negative impacts of climate change under a 0.8 centigrade temperature increase, that's what we have now, had 2 years ago, are already widespread across the globe, and that danger, risk, and harm would be utterly unacceptable in a 2-degree warmer world, largely for them, the mollusks, the coral reefs, and the poor and marginalized populations, not only in poor countries, even if this danger has not quite hit home yet for us. Right? So the argument that 2 is utterly unacceptable, we really need to do better than that. And for those of you who follow, Paris Agreement from last year has 1.5 now in there, saying significantly below 2, better 1.5. Background number 4. This expert group that I introduced earlier from the Warsaw International Mechanism has one particular action area, and that's the one we're working on, which is called non-economic loss and damage, or short, NELS, non-economic losses. So I hope several of you cringe, because non-economic is really a bad term. You should protest already. Come on. Nonetheless, it's in the UN Convention. That's the term that is used. We often say non-market, which is not perfect either. We can say intangible. We can say indirect. What we mean are these 9 areas that you see up there in the little graphic. So these are areas for which we can really not easily identify damages or losses. And we don't really want to put a dollar value on them, because we understand it's really difficult. It's culturally specific, and we don't have a unit that we can globally use. So they're now known as incommensurable. Biodiversity, societal global identity, indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage, life, health, human mobility, and territory. So here are these categories. And so there have been several workshops and conferences, and by now you recognize me. So next time I don't need the orange arrow, to understand how do we deal with these NELS, these non-economic losses. How do we do that? And our group here, the one funded by the Worldwide Universities Network, again, Dave and Marit are part of it, we deal precisely with these types of non-economic losses. How do we deal with them? How do we understand them? How do we identify them? Can we potentially assess them, even if we don't want to measure them, even if we don't want to put a dollar value on them? So various people have attempted to categorize what these NELS may be. This is one attempt, came out this year, to differentiate, to break down these 9 areas I introduced you to into intrinsic and instrumental and non-material and material. There are various typologies that are out there. But we think these typologies actually are not good enough. We can do better than that. There are also ways of valuing NELD, in this case NELD, non-economic loss and damage, and their compatibility with selected attributes. So these are different ways of valuing, of assessing and measuring here. And I'm sure you're familiar with some of them, actually use some of them. I'm not going to go into them because I want to speak about a different aspect that many of you may not be that familiar with. And I'll explain in a second what that is. Right? So these are out here. Yes, Steve?
Just a clarification. By incommensurability and economic variation compatible, does that relate to the lexicographic preferences?
I have not the slightest idea.
Okay.
Help. I don't know. This is not my area, but these are out there. We can talk. Whoever has a good answer, please jump in.
Probably does, I'd say, but maybe not only.
No, it's more the opinion of the authors.
I think so. But it could be lexicographic preferences, because you can't do trade-offs.
No, it's more about moral values, and not economic.
Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marit. Okay. So this is out there, and we still feel this is not quite what we need. So out of a group of people I interact with, some geographers, some not, is an article now forthcoming in Nature and Climate Change that calls for a socially engaged science of loss. So we need a better understanding of the social drivers that will allow us to better identify where losses occur for whom, whether they're intolerable or acceptable, whether or not that changes over time or not. And so the purpose here is to try to explain what people value. So that's the only way to better understand such a social, to better practice such a socially engaged science of loss. To explain what people highly value, how climate change imperils these most valued phenomena, and the strategies for embracing and managing grief that will inevitably come with losses. So look out for it. It's going to be in Nature and Climate Change in November, which is very exciting. At the same time, so this is a short paper because it's a commentary, we also have one which is not accepted yet, but it's under review, one that went to WIRES, so Wirely Interdisciplinary Reviews on Climate Change, with all these wonderful authors here, trying to better address and summarize, discuss the literature that exists on values, places, and experiences. And I want to talk for the rest of my time on this approach. How can we understand what people value in their daily experiences in specific places? And how can we take that understanding to better inform both the science on loss as well as the policy negotiations within the UNFCCC that desperately try to fill that gap in knowledge about non-economic losses. And so I have the citation down here. You will see it for the rest of the slides where we draw upon material that the group has developed. And here is the entire group again, as I said, with a variety of partners, some of them with a background in philosophy, but also psychology, social work, geography, many of you who are here in the room with an economics angle, but also ecology. So it's a wonderful, diverse group, and we have worked hard a couple of months ago to think through the complexity of this issue. So how can we understand values, and does that understanding of values help us to determine loss? So again, I want to put up the definitions of adaptation and limits to adaptation to remind us that this is about what people value. And then I want to say, well, of course, there are different disciplinary ways of dealing with value. So we have the one here, the economic lens, market-based preferences, revealed stated preference methods, value transfer. Several of you use that. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm also not going to talk about the ecological lens of values, the debate between what is an intrinsic and instrumental value when we talk about nature, and how relationships between people and nature change or break up that binary between intrinsic and instrumental. I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy lens on values, values as part of ethics, moral principles, a good life, but also a justice dimension. I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology lens, drawing upon basic or universal values, beliefs, principles that guide our actions. I will talk most about the human geography lens because I feel this is something I can introduce and maybe enrich the work you already are doing. And I'm going to talk about lived values. So values that people share in their daily life through lived experiences, making what we call the everyday visible. And if we take that last lens, we know that loss is a matter of what people value in their daily lives and what they want to protect, what they feel is worth protecting and saving. This is what we call lived value. And loss is given meaning through places people live in. And these kind of values are very difficult to model, to measure, so we need different ways of accessing them, identifying them, extracting them from case studies. They're very often not tangible. There's some literature, some of them come out of anthropology, some of those come out of work with indigenous populations. Some of those come out of work on climate change adaptation, drawing upon other psychological definitions. I want to show you two here, just so that we understand that there are different frameworks for values out there. So the one to the left is from philosophy. So these are basic values that in philosophy are well understood. Some of those you may think, well, maybe they're relevant for climate change adaptation, losses. Others may not. Here are those from Schwartz. Several of you may be familiar with those, the 10 basic values. Again, some of those will be of use in our understanding of climate change, but others may not be. So what we're really interested in is to understand these kinds of values. These lived values, and they come from a variety of literatures, case studies, insights. And we could say that many of the things people value are around well-being. It's around well-being in a particular place. So place is important. Sense of belonging is important. Place attachment. Identity, how we define ourselves, living in a certain place. And what is important to us in there and what we would like to protect. And then all those around, we think, are really good examples of values, what people value. And they range, of course, from a good human life to a good life for non-human species, ecosystems, biodiversity, and so on. And they range from the individual, a person or microorganism, all the way to a system, a social system, a society, a state, the world, but also complex social ecological systems. Now, to kind of convey why this is important, I'm going to show you a slide that a colleague of us, who also was at the workshop, John Barnett, and Dave, you will remember him, he uses that slide very often to get across that what people value may not seem meaningful to us, may not even seem rational. But who are we to decide what you or you or you value is wrong? So John Barnett works quite a bit in Pacific Islands, and he uses this image very often. And that's an image of eBay on Marshall Islands. And so when you look at that image, what comes to mind? What do you think? Quickly. What comes to mind? Sea level rise, fine. What else?
Flooding.
Flooding, fine.
Hurricane.
Hurricane, yes.
Tsunami.
Tsunami, yes. What else?
Bankrupt state.
Bankrupt state, yep.
Good beaches.
Good peaches. No, you must be kidding. You're cynical.
No agricultural land.
No agricultural land, darn. Is that nice? Not to you.
Is that the whole island?
It's the whole island, right? That's it. It's an atoll.
It could be a nice place for the islanders as a whole.
So that's the point, right? So John says, this looks pretty awful, right? This is not how you and I imagine an island or an atoll in the Pacific, right? We come with our romantic ideas of really beautiful beaches and palm trees and white sand and a little cocktail. Well, this is not it, right? It's pretty awful. But if we think that sea level rise is already occurring, and we know it is, and it's going to get worse, maybe in 10 years, if we have a picture of this place in 10 years, maybe we have a huge seawall around it, and it will look even more awful. But who are we to say that this is not a livable place? If people on this particular island, on this atoll, decide, like Tuvalu has done, that they will do everything they can to continue living in this place because this particular place is what defines them. It's their home, it's their identity, it's their cultural belonging. Who cares if it doesn't look like we have, that we imagine it? Some people say, well, Manhattan looks like this. Not a whole lot of a difference. Right? So the point is, we cannot define for other people what they ought to value.
Who are them?
Who are them? The people who live in these places. All of them.
Traditionally or?
All of them, right?
Okay.
I mean, keep in mind, Tuvalu, as I said earlier, follows the same strategy. Kiribati equally at risk from climate change follows a very different strategy. Their strategy is migration with dignity, buying land in Hawaii. Right? So who are we to decide? That's the point. So I'm going to go a little quicker here now. The point here is that in our group, we try to understand place-based approaches to loss. Can we understand what people value through their connection with place? And by place, we don't just mean a locale. We don't just mean a little place, a little dot on the map. Place is understanding, knowing, being in the world, with good examples from indigenous populations and their connections to land, but not only indigenous. There are good studies here in Western Australia about place attachment and the increased willingness to prepare for bushfires because place attachment is meaningful. We also know that place-based experiences often differ from what the science tells us, what the policies tell us about how we should act in a certain climatic, or under certain climatic hazard, flood, for example. What people do is not always what policymakers recommend. Why? Because it's tied to what they value. Right? Now, I want to show you 3 examples here that we already also discussed in the paper. And these are all from Australia, 2 from drought and 1 from sea level rise flooding. So the first example is from the Millennium Australian drought. And what it shows here is that people are willing to endure in a place because that's what they think their identity is constructed about. This is what they do. As an Australian farmer, you endure. And they said, well, what really became problematic, and when that endurance is very, very stressed, when the expectation to be resilient is very, very stressed, is not when the harvest fails. It's not when the climate records indicate an extreme event. It is when the social fabric breaks down. It's when people could no longer play sports because their fields had dried up and they were not useful to play in them anymore. This is when community cohesion breaks down. These are the everyday experiences of drought, not the meteorological record, not the agricultural drought. But nonetheless, people say, we hang on, we endure, because that's what we ought to do. In the second case study, this is Gippsland East. It's flooding. People also endure. So these are residents in very exposed, low-lying areas that nonetheless stay in these places and downplay the floods that come more frequently and with high intensity. They downplay them by saying, actually, it's not that bad. Oh, it just lasts 10 minutes. We just mop it up afterwards. And hey, actually, it's fun. Something is happening. Right? They downplay those, and we want to understand why that is and for how long that can go on. And the most, I think, insightful but nonetheless worrisome example is, again, the Australian drought. This is work by 2 human geographers who look at the drivers for the actually shockingly high suicide rates among male farmers. And that comes with the expectations that male farmers in Australia, ought to be resilient, ought to be tough, ought to just suck it up, especially men. Right? The construction of what we call male subjectivities, the guys ought to be tough and resilient, is problematic because it just didn't work. Many farmers were unable to live up to the expectation of being resilient, and hence it resulted in, well, fruitless stoicism, a lot of shame, and ultimately high rates of suicide. And that has to do with the image of a fallen hero, the hero who cannot be the tough Aussie and cannot really provide for the family and cannot be the Aussie battler. Right? So people value something here, their identity. They want to cling on to it, but it comes at a cost. And this is what we explore. A quick example, similar from Ghana. This is work I've done with farmers in the northern part of Ghana. Same story, drought, failing farmer, cannot keep up the expectation of being really on top of the task, managing a drying landscape, but also a socially dried up landscape, and a lot of out-migration to urban areas. In this case, the breaking point was not that people couldn't play soccer or football on fields anymore. The social breaking point here was that people felt very depressed, not just about the changing environmental conditions, but ultimately about the fact that they were forced to drink water from the same source as their animals. That was the social breaking point. It was not the climatic record. It was not the decreasing number of rain days. It was the fact that they were forced to share the water, which felt to them as the ultimately dehumanizing fact, and that was intolerable. So our understanding is maybe we can look more for these critical thresholds, these social tipping points that give us an indication of limits to adaptation. So we've been trying to do that more systematically, and here's one example, and we have that in the paper, where the same two cases, Australian farmers and drought, Ghanaian farmers and drought, look at the details of values around place, identity, and health. And the description here are examples of why and when and for whom these critical thresholds may be reached or may be within very close reach. So that's a different way of potentially assessing what is at stake for people and where loss may occur. And we can't quantify that, but we know it's out there, and we have to find a way to more constructively capture these dimensions so policymakers in the UNFCCC have a way of incorporating those. We also know that people make trade-offs among their values. It's not just that people value one thing. All of us value different things, but we may value some things more than others. And so we want to understand how these trade-offs happen. And again, they may not be rational. May not be rational to us, but may be very rational to the people who undertake them. And so there are choices people make, and sometimes these choices are tough. And maybe sometimes we don't want to be in situations where we have to make these choices, but we nonetheless have to. So we need to understand these trade-offs not as binaries, part of these rigid typologies I showed you, but we have to understand them as dynamic. They change over time. They change with conditions. Sometimes these losses occur sequentially, back to back, boom, boom, boom. And that changes what people value and can protect and want to protect and actually do protect. And we want to make sure we have a better understanding of how these trade-offs change in the future. So the way we approached it in our paper is to think about what we call a relational theory of risk. And the relation is between an object at risk, a stressor, a climate stressor, and the relationship between these two to make a decision, to understand what is potentially at stake and what is potentially going to be lost. That is always going to be socially constructed. There's no formula for it. It depends on the context. It depends on the people. And we have to continually, as people, reevaluate these choices. Okay? Now, this is all very abstract. I fully understand that. I'm going to show you our fabulous graphic. We've worked so hard on that. And we just cross our fingers that it's going to be accepted. But this is the way we think about it. So we think about it as a heuristic. We think about this relational framing of loss by trying to understand where people make decisions and how their lineup of potentially lived values, what people value in their lives, changes. So here I've put up 4 identity, farming, land, and health. And the first step is to say, well, which of those do they value more? So we have a horizontal axis, highly valued to not as highly valued. And in our case here, this is the example, people value identity and farming most. Land, okay. And health, of course, they also value health, but not as much as identity and farming. The space here, this big red bubble, is the loss space with a gradient from acceptable all the way to unacceptable and intolerable. If we then put a vertical axis on top of that, that looks at a climate impact from a very limited impact down here to very high, significant impact up there, we could see how people may position their lived values slightly differently. And what we see in the limited number of case studies we have analyzed so far is that often people would put their identity in farming, which we know they value highly, also up here because they are often under threat from climate change. So it's very much up there in the intolerable space. Whereas health, we've seen that also consistently, is something that people often are willing to sacrifice to maintain and protect these up here. Of course, we understand that adaptation is possible. So people are going to do something to protect, to lower the risk on all those. So this is potential adaptation. There's a lot people could do for health, but people are going to invest more time and money and energy to protect what matters to them most and what is up here in that very high risk space. We can break up that area and look at details in adaptation pathways, adaptation tipping points, like the socially salient ones I gave you earlier, and look at limits to adaptation. We know this is the space where people endure, where people are maybe willing to endure more, but we also know it comes at a cost. And we have seen that surprisingly in our case studies, often at the cost of health. People are willing to sacrifice their health to keep these alive, right? So what we want is a better understanding of the socially salient tipping points. Again, drinking from the same water source as animal is a socially salient tipping point. This is what pushes people over the edge. We want to understand what are unacceptable risks or impacts or losses. We want to understand what are acceptable trade-offs. What is it that people are willing to do to protect what they value most, but what is it also that people are willing to do to let go of certain things they value? And maybe we can think about avoided impacts, that's the term the climate scientists like to use, to understand if they could potentially avoid a looming loss by shifting what is at stake, what is valued, to an acceptable damage. Still not ideal, but these are the choices people are often confronted with. Last two to wrap it up. We've tried to come up with case studies that look at value trade-offs. What are the options people face? On the left-hand side, these are the options that we have identified in the literature for Australian farmers in the context of drought. And the options are very straightforward. Either you leave the farm and engage in something that we call place detachment. You detach yourself and your identity from the place, the farm you're on, while assuming a new identity of potentially doing some business in the city. It's possible. You can stay in place and continue enduring, but again, it may come at a cost. It says here, cost for personal well-being, health, but also family relations. There is quite strong evidence from people who have worked on gender dimensions. In the case of the Australian drought, Murray-Darling Basin, for example, that the difficult situations both men and women were in did result in higher domestic violence. We can't quantify, but we know it's out there. Or people could choose to embrace the kind of entrepreneurial, neoliberal, savvy farmer who uses, I don't know, precision agriculture to survive in an increasingly difficult environment. This is the one to avoid. But of course, we know it's an option. What trajectory people choose depends on what they value and what they're willing to let go. We can do the same for the islands in the Pacific. Remember, again, eBay. These are the choices. You either stay, and it will look like eBay, potentially Tuvalu, or you move, give up your land, and this is what Kiribati pursues. There are no easy answers, but the group decides it's worth looking into these cases and having more systematic comparative, more case studies to do a systematic and comparative analysis to see if that initial pattern that we see holds true across many more case studies. But again, the pattern we see is people value, defend, protect. We may think it's irrational, we may think it's silly, but they protect what they value most, and that's often their identity at the expense of other issues. Next steps. So that's what we want to do. As I just said, we want to focus on the systematic comparative analysis, we understand that these predefined risk assessments and the typologies we see are not sufficient for NELS. We know that, but we are working on better tools, and everybody on the team will put their best ideas forward on how to do that, and we already have some that are on the table. We know that values that are tied to places are important in people's decision-making processes. But we also have to have respect and encourage a dialogue between people on the ground and policy decision makers on how to proceed if places do become increasingly unlivable. We want to make visible these losses, and this is my role. I'm now on the expert committee, the only academic on the expert committee to Action Area 4, the non-economic losses of the UN Convention, the Warsaw International Mechanism. I make these contributions there, and we'll see where it goes. And we're going to present in less than a month at the next COP, COP22 in Marrakesh, exactly on that issue. And here is the announcement of the side event. We feel it's really important, and actually the system forces us, but I think it's also that we realize it's important to hook up, we academics, to hook up with people on the ground who work with NGOs on loss in the context of climate change. And we've managed to partner up with 2 organizations, NGOs, out of Bangladesh who have a very grounded understanding and insight into what losses, sea level rise, of course, and flooding and storm surges mean for people's lives and livelihoods in Bangladesh. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm happy to report back when I'm back in town. Thank you.